All right. Hi everyone, and welcome to the second Facts First PH research briefing. I would like to welcome friends from the media, civil society groups, members of Facts First PH initiative, and we also have attendees signed up from social media. I'm Jella Gonzalez, by the way, the tech editor of Rappler. And welcome to everyone who's watching us via Rappler's main Facebook page, MovePH, and the Newsbreak Facebook pages. We are live there right now for this research briefing. So just a little something about Facts First PH before we start. Facts First PH is an initiative where more than 100 other media including Rappler and civil society groups, come together and take a stand to protect the facts and move towards a healthier and safer public space online. And one of the parts of of Facts First is a research layer. And in this research layer, part of the research layer is this research briefing held weekly. It's where research groups will do an analysis on the data generated through this fact-checking effort to gain insights on narratives and networks aimed at manipulating the public ahead of the elections in May. Our research briefing today, it's called the Philippine Cyber Political Divide, Political Polarization on Twitter amid the 2022 Philippine presidential elections. So this research studies tens of thousands of tweets from October 2021 to March 2022 from supporters of the two leading presidential candidates, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Leni Robredo. The tweets were analyzed for their sentiments, whether the tweets were negative or positive towards a candidate, whether they were retweeting tweets from their own network, and whether one group tweets more negatively than the other, among other factors and things, with the goal of gaining insights on how polarized the current Twitter information ecosystem is with regards to the upcoming elections. To present us his work is Gilbert Chua, a PhD and data science student in the Asian Institute of Management and an honorary member of the Analytics, Computing, and Complex Systems Laboratory. He is interested in delving deep into the workings of social systems through the lens of machine learning, graph theory, and complexity. We will have a question and answer portion later after the briefing. You can send in your questions through the chat box, and we'll make you a panelist so you can read your own questions. Or if you want to have us read your questions, just please indicate in the chat box also. So, Mr. Chua, welcome, and you may now take the floor.
All right, thank you so much for that kind introduction. So once again, my name is Gilbert Chua, and I am a member of Facts First PH. So what I will be showing here, or what I will be discussing, is the Philippine cyber political divide, political polarization on Twitter amid the 2022 Philippine presidential elections. So it's a very long name, so it's quite a mouthful actually, just to say it. So please bear with me for the next few minutes, and I will do my best to communicate to you the results of our research. So what you're seeing here is called a Twitter quote network. Each circle or each node represents a unique Twitter account. And if there is a line from one node to another, from one account to another, then that means that account quoted the other account. And it is with this framework that we will be looking at political polarization and how we will also be looking at the dynamics between the supporters of various presidential votes. And however, we'll be touching on that a little later. We'll be delving into that a little later. But first, some context. So there was a study about the polarization in the United States and their presidential elections. And this was in the year 2021, so it's quite recently. It's within the past year. So their main finding, one of the findings that they have is that individuals who report hating their political opponents are the most likely to share political fake news and selectively share content that is useful for derogating these opponents. Overall, our findings are actually their findings show that fake news sharing is fueled by the same psychological motivations that drive other forms of partisan behavior, including sharing partisan news from traditional and credible news sources. So we've had this study done in the United States, and there are actually multiple supporting studies that also give the same or support the same ideas that this specific study has shown. And this study was actually done on Twitter. So it got me thinking, do we have that kind of behavior in the Philippines? So what I decided to do was to look at the polarization aspect, not so much on specifically the spread of fake news, as we lack information on that as of now. But what we wanted to look at was the political polarization, because according to this study and a few other studies before it, hating their political opponents are the most people who hate their political opponents, who share their hatred about their political opponents, are the ones most likely to share political fake news as well. So it's kind of like we're setting the environment by looking at the polarization between groups of people, between political groups. And that's what we want to tackle in this study. So just a few results from that study. And what is most interesting here is this one, the graph on the right. So each bar represents how much of that news coming from different sources was collected. And what we can see here, it's colored by the number of the participants who declared themselves to be either Democrats, independents, or Republicans. And on the left side, on the leftmost side here, under the fake demographic part, this represents the number of people and the political affiliation of people who share fake democratic news, meaning it's fake news, but it has a democratic lean to it. And on the rightmost side, we have the fake Republican. So fake news that is leaning towards the Republicans, and also comes from Republican sources. So what we can see here is that for the fake democratic news, it is almost entirely blue. It is almost entirely other Democrats that share fake democratic news. And on the rightmost side here, a vast majority of them are Republicans, and you cannot even see any Democrats sharing fake Republican news. So this is interesting because the political affiliation or their self-declared political affiliation influences their behavior and their propensity to share fake news. And that's what we want to tackle. We want to understand this political polarization. We want to understand this political landscape on Twitter. So polarization in the Philippines, how do we go about it? What's one way, how can we go about seeing the polarization on Twitter? And one way is to get the data, is to look at the data. So what I did was to collect almost 450,000 election-related tweets, which became part of the top 10 trends from October 1, 2021, all the way to March 12, 2022, just earlier this week. And if we're looking at the Philippines trends, for those who may not be familiar with Twitter, this is what it looks like. So on one part of your screen, if you are on the desktop or on your mobile, you'll be able to see these trends that come out that are shown by Twitter. So trending topics are highlighted by Twitter. And so these become even more visible to the people who are browsing their feeds. So it can become more visible if they look at specifically on the Philippine trends part of Twitter. And if we look here on the right side, this is a table of this is just a sample. This is like actually a very small sample of the 128 election-related topics and election-related hashtags that we were able to collect. So from this topic, we can see that it's not just hashtags, but also just phrases that are often repeated. In this case, we have bring back Marcos. Isko, number 10, Robredo for president, and hashtag NBA All-Star. So we went through all of these these topics that were part of the top 10 trends hourly from October 1 all the way to March 12, 2022. And we manually tagged them to be either election related or not. So it can be quite obvious because you're only looking at the top 10 trends, and almost all of the topics have the names or have a corresponding name of the candidate that they're referring to. In this case, if Bring Back Marcos, yes, it is indeed election related, because if you were to just do a scan of the topic Bring Back Marcos, you will find that the topics are related to the upcoming 2022 elections. And what we did after we tagged them, whether or not they are related to the elections, because obviously NBA All-Star is not, we attributed them to the candidates that were mentioned in the topic. And in this case, with Bring Back Marcos, it is referring to Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And then on top of that, we also looked at the polarity, meaning if the topic or the hashtag is explicitly for the candidate, then they are tagged as positive. However, in the case of topics or hashtags that simply mention the name of a candidate, for example, in this case, Isko, we have to assume that it is positive in nature, and we'll revisit that assumption later on. So in this case, we gathered around 128 topics that trended since October 1, 2021, and which are election related. So by using this classification method, Twitter has actually helped us already sift through the data in order to make it easier to classify the tweets. So if we group them all up, if we group the 128 trends together and look at the number of tweets attributed to each one and add them all up, we'll find that the one that has the greatest, or the one that's being talked most about, at least among the top trended and election-related tweets, is Leni Robredo, accounting for almost 2/3 of the tweets since October 1, 2021. And what's interesting here is that if you are of the idea that the trending topics or the election-related topics on Twitter are largely negative, if you're starting to feel that way, then by looking at these numbers, we see that most of the tweets are actually positive in nature. Almost 97% of tweets are not attributed to negative topics. And even these topics are related to positive polarity. And again, I just want to reiterate that simple name mentions are assumed to be positive. And this is working under the old adage of there is no such thing as bad publicity. Meaning if you're being talked about, then it's good for you. That's the assumption. That's the guiding principle on the assumption that we applied here. And yeah, so if someone is mentioned so many times, then it is assumed to be positive. And yeah, so in order to further break this down, we looked at the candidates that actually had topics which trended that can be attributed positively or negatively to them. And out of all the presidential candidates we were able to get from the trending tweets, we found that only Leni Robredo and Ferdinand Marcos Jr. were the ones that had hashtags or topics that were explicitly positive and explicitly negative to them. The rest of the candidates, Isko Moreno, Manny Pacquiao, and Ping Lacson, we were unable to find tweets. We were unable to find topics that were talking about them with a positive slant or a negative slant. So yeah, moving forward, by looking at the proportions of the accounts, so we're talking about accounts now, no longer the tweets. We found that out of all of the tweets, around almost 140,000 accounts that we looked at, around 73% of them are ones that tweet primarily about Leni Robredo. So in terms of the proportions, they talk most about Leni Robredo. And the second one would be Isko Moreno with around 21,000, corresponding to approximately 16 or 15 to 16% of the accounts on Twitter that we were able to find. And on the third one is Ferdinand Marcos Jr. in terms of the number of users, again, that we're looking at, making up close to 5% of the population. So again, when I talk about account support, I am saying that this is about accounts that have historically, since October 1 at least, that have historically shown or majority of their tweets have been about these candidates. That's what I mean by account support here. And if we were to look at the trends, because we want to look at the behavior on the proportions of the tweets that are trending over time and the ones and the candidates that are being talked about most. I narrowed down the view just to Robredo and to Marcos. And since January 1, 2022, there have been bursts of negative activity on certain days around both Marcos Jr. and Robredo. For example, we can see here that the pink lines are ones that either talk about Leni Robredo and talk about her positively, and those that are just generally mention Leni Robredo, and the ones in red are the ones that talk about Marcos Jr. positively or simply mention him. While the black and green ones, the black ones are the black trend corresponds to tweets which are negatively framing Robredo, while the ones in green are the ones that frame Marcos Jr. negatively. And we can see that there is a lot of variability across the different days. And we see that it spikes sometimes, and there are certain spikes, and they are the ones which experience the most burstiness or the spikiness if we were to look at this graph. For example, we can see a very high peak here around February 5 to 7 around Marcos Jr. There were a lot of negative tweets about him. And if we look, starting from around March, within the first week of March, there was suddenly a very big spike in terms of the support or the number of tweets which are either talking about just Leni Robredo or talking about her positively. So moving forward, if we break this down even further, because we have a classification for them, those that primarily talk about Marcos Jr. and those who primarily talk about Robredo, is that there are the trends between groups highlight the negativity towards the others most tweeted about candidates. And in this case, for example, if we were to look at this graph, those accounts that primarily tweet either positively or just about Ferdinand Marcos Jr., we see that there are a lot of negative tweets about Leni Robredo. So the other camp, essentially, if we were to look at this as a duality, they have a lot of negative tweets about the other camp. However, if we were to look on the other side, on those who tweet largely about Leni Robredo, we see that ever since, since starting January 1, there has been a lot of negative tweets about Marcos Jr. As opposed to if we were to look at those who tweet about Marcos Jr. Positively or primarily, the large activity or an uptick in the activity of negativity towards Leni Robredo started around the last week of January. So that's a comparison that would be that's interesting to make. So the timing and the activity between these two groups is can be quite different. And what's even more interesting is that in the first week of March, both groups started tweeting much more heavily about Leni Robredo. And this is the part where we have to look at our assumption again, because our assumption is that tweets about Leni Robredo are positive in nature, especially if they just mention her name. But it's interesting that from those who have historically tweeted more about Marcos Jr., that they also started doing the same in the first week of March. And this is something we'll revisit again a bit later. So we'll have to recontextualize what it means to tweet about a candidate. And yeah, so looking at the negativity across the different groups, looking at the negativity of those accounts that have historically tweeted most about Leni Robredo and those accounts that historically have tweeted most about Ferdinand Marcos Jr., we find that the accounts who have been tweeting about Lenny Robredo have more than 3 times the volume of negative tweets than those that tweet primarily about Ferdinand Marcos Jr. So as highlighted here, there are almost 7,000 tweets that are attributed negatively from the accounts that have been tweeting about Lenny Robredo. And from those accounts that have tweeted about Marcos Jr. historically, like a lot, it's only in the ballpark of 2 to 2,500. So we see in absolute terms, in terms of absolute value, those that have been tweeting about Lenny Robredo, there are a lot of negative tweets that they have produced, much more than those that have tweeted historically about Marcos Jr. However, if we start controlling or start getting proportions, we find that accounts tweeting primarily about Ferdinand Marcos Jr. have more than 6 times the rate of negative tweets relative to those that tweet about Lenny Robredo. So one way to think about this is that if you were to randomly pick a tweet out of the 340,534 tweets that are attributed to accounts that tweet about Lenny Robredo, you will have a 2% chance of pulling out a negative tweet or something that talks negatively about someone. However, if we were to do that same exercise for the accounts or the tweets of those that have historically tweeted about Ferdinand Marcos Jr., there is now a 12 to 13% chance. So it's more than 6 times the rate of negative tweets. And if you were to look now on an account level in terms of the accounts, the proportion of accounts having tweeted mostly about Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and have tweeted using a negative topic at least once is around 3 times that of those who tweet about Lenny Robredo. For example, if I simply tweeted one time negatively about a candidate and I've been tagged as having primarily tweeted about Marcos Jr. before, then I would become part of this 11.48%. And the same goes for those who have shown support or have been tweeting primarily about Lenny Robredo. So it's up to 3 times. So again, doing the same exercise, if I were to select a single account out of all of the accounts that have tweeted mostly about Marcos Jr., I would have almost a 12% chance of getting someone who has tweeted negatively since October 1 at least. So we can see here that in proportion-wise, there are different behaviors between the two camps in terms of the negative behavior. And now going back to this one, what is the Twitter quote network actually? Again, I'd like to reiterate that each circle is an account and each line from one account to another is one Twitter account quoting the other. So they come in pairs. Just to highlight it even more, this is an example of a quote tweet. For example, Mirna quoted a tweet by Alice, and we can see that, yeah, this is what it would look like. If Alice is the blue one and the orange one is Mirna, then there will be a line from Alice to Mirna. And taking a look, we see that there are 2 fairly large groups or clusters of in this network that we can find. And if we look at this of this large one, there is a secondary cluster to the right of it. And what's interesting to note there is that this group of people, the one on the right, is a mix of both pink and red accounts interacting with each other. And the way we've color coded these ones is to show the relative support for Lenny Robredo and Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And those that are purple/pink, they are accounts that have historically tweeted more about Lenny Robredo than other candidates. And those that are colored red are accounts that have tweeted largely about Ferdinand Marcos Jr. more than other candidates. So it's interesting to see that there is actually a mix of the supporters or those that have tweeted a lot about Lenny Robredo and those that tweet a lot about Marcos Jr. So isolating the network or just highlighting the activities of those who have primarily tweeted about the Robredo, 95% of the quotes of Net Lenny, so that's what we're calling them, just for, it's getting tiring to keep saying it again. Around 95% of the quotes of Net Lenny accounts are also Net Lenny accounts. Meaning if I were to look at all of the quotes, if I were to look at all of the quotations done by Net Lenny accounts, the odds are they will be from other Net Lenny accounts as well. Oh, sorry, that's better explained here. 87% of quotes made by Net Lenny accounts also come from Net Lenny accounts. And we can see this behavior as, we can attribute this behavior as sort of an echo chamber, wherein you are interacting primarily only with others like yourself. And this leads to, this type of echo chamber behavior leads to your message getting sent to other people who already have the same behavior as you do. And looking deeper and contrasting it with those who have tweeted primarily about Marcos Jr., only 50% of the quotes of Net Marcos Jr. accounts are also Net Marcos Jr. accounts. So this is
Hi everyone. It seems we've Gilbert dropped the call, but we'll try to reconnect in a while. Please hold. All right. So our panelist Gilbert was cut, but we'll try to get him reconnected as soon as we can. Please hold for a while. And you can send in your questions, by the way, through our chat box. We can read them for you, or if you want to ask the questions yourselves, we can also put you up as a panelist. All right. Enough pang questions. Okay, so we'll have Gilbert back in about 5 minutes, but so we'll have Jules Kiang talk about facts first for the moment. Jules,
Hi, Jello. Hello.
hi.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much, everyone, no, for watching our weekly briefing. Jello, this is the second time that we are doing this. And it's very important to note that the participation, of course, of our research group kasi very important nga na mas mapalalim natin yung mga sources, yung mga actors, kung sino ba yung mga sources ng mga disinformation. So we are really grateful to several of our research groups for doing this. But let me talk about Jello very quickly about Facts First PH. We launched this on the last week of January. And since Feb, nag-start yung operations natin, more than 200 fact checks yung na-produce ng ating mga newsrooms. And this is very important kasi nasasabayan natin somehow yung bilis ng mga disinformation na kumakalat sa iba't ibang platforms. Kasi ever since nabanggit na to in many research reports and forums, no, na iba't ibang klaseng modes yung disinformation na lumalabas ngayon, iba't ibang klaseng mga platforms. Today, our speaker was talking about disinformation via tweets, among others, pero that's just siguro parang a parcel of the whole big picture. So we're very grateful to our research groups for consolidating their efforts para mas malaman natin yung bigger picture. If I could share, hold on. Teka lang. Anyway, we've been sharing the visual of Facts First PH. Ito yung parang pyramid natin. I'm trying to share lang. Hold on. Anyway, I couldn't share it right now, but siguro very quickly lang para lang sa mga viewers natin na first time marinig ang Facts First PH. Basically, it's a multi-sector and multi-layered initiative that aims to basically address this information during this election period. And we are following a whole of society approach. Why whole of society approach? Kasi hindi lang ito kakayanin ng mga journalists o hindi lang ito kakayanin ng mga fact checkers natin. Kailangan simultaneous yung efforts natin para tugunan itong disinformation. So nabanggit ko na multi-layer to dahil meron po tayong apat na mga layers. The first layer is fact-checking layer. At ito po yung layer na nakatutok syempre sa pag-monitor ng social media para sa mga dubious claims. At ito nga po ay binubuo ng iba't ibang mga newsrooms at mga fact-checkers natin. So nakakatuwa po dito, gaya ng binabanggit natin, para siyang Avengers Assemble moment. Kasi iba't ibang mga newsrooms po yung nagsama-sama, nag-unite basically para tugunan at i-address itong disinformation. So sila po yung may task na mag-fact check ng mga dubious claims. So kung meron po kayong nakita na mga false claims, na mga dubious claims, so sa tingin nyo kahinahinala na mga posts whether on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, o TikTok, maaari nyo po yung isend sa mga tip lines natin. Pwede nyo pong silipin sa rappler.com at sa page din po natin sa Facebook kung ano-ano po itong mga tip lines na to. Maaari pong via Facebook, maaari din pong via Viber. So pwede nyo pong isend doon itong mga dubious claims na to. At pag na-send din nyo, ang magiging workflow natin dito, ipa-fact check po siya ng ating mga fact checkers. Okay. Number 2 po, meron po tayong mesh layer. Itong mesh layer natin, binubuo siya ng maraming mga civil society organizations, meron din po tayong mga business associations, meron din po tayong mga religious organizations. So nakakatawa po dito talagang iba't ibang salik po ng civil society ay nagsama-sama para po mas i-amplify pa itong disinformation. So ang goal po ng mesh layer ay para mas mapaingay, of course, sa mga fact checks at sila rin po yung gumagawa ng iba't ibang mga campaigns. So ito po yung asahan natin ito po yung aasahan natin para mas mapaingay pa natin yung fact checking sa panahon ng eleksyon. Okay. And then the third one is ito nga pong research layer. Nakita nyo kanina, si Gilbert, siya yung nag-present kanina, bahagi sila ng research layer. So sila po yung nakaatas na gumawa ng research reports. So we are actually expecting 1 to 2 research reports per week para mas maunawaan natin kung bakit nangyayari itong mga information, saan, paano, sino ang mga nagpasimula. Kasi mahalagang matukoy natin kung paano to nagsisimula at bakit nila sinisimulan nito. So we expect weekly po itong mga briefings natin. And lastly, we also have the accountability layer, and this is composed of legal and human rights groups. So the main purpose of this layer is, of course, to monitor and document attacks. Okay, attacks against journalists, attacks against fact checkers, attacks against the members of Facts First PH, and even the netizens who are just sharing fact checks, because it's not new, no, na kapag fact checking pinag-uusapan natin, especially lately, if you've been reading the news, no, under attack itong purpose of fact checking, and which is really I find it very weird, Jello, no, na the basic essence of fact checking is being attacked or being demonized. So we should turn up the script kasi hindi naman talaga dapat ganun ang narrative. When you're talking about fact checking, basically it's very basic. 'Di ba na you're just you're fighting for the facts, you're fighting for the truth. And what's wrong with that? So yun yung tinutukoy ng accountability layer natin. So all these 4 layers, sabay-sabay po yan na kumikilos for this Facts First PH initiative. So if you are interested, if you are part of a civil society, if you are part of a newsroom, and if you want to be part of Facts First PH, you can reach out to us by emailing us at info@factsfirst.ph para po makapag-set po tayo ng onboarding. We do regular onboardings para po makasama kayo sa growing roster of Facts First PH. So that's it, Jello, so far.
All right, thanks, Jules. So we're still waiting for Gilbert. May parang brownout ata sa kanila, Jules. So
Okay.
I have an update in a few minutes kung ano yung magiging ganap natin dito. So siguro ano mo lang, gaano kalaki pa yung problema at gaano yung roster natin yan, di ba? Ang dami na natin, parang hundreds of organizations just teaming up to fight fake news, disinformation, all these things na yun. Pagod na tayong kalabanin, pero ang laki pa din yung problema.
Mm-hmm.
Gaano kalayo pa tayo dun sa goal natin na yun, sa tingin mo?
I think malayo pa.
Malayo pa.
Hindi ko alam kung paano ko ma-expose
malayo.
Pero I think kasi Jello, para siyang yung understanding ko dito, ako hindi ako ganun ka lubog pa sa usapin ng research and lalo na sa fact checking. Parang this year ko lang talaga, 2021 lang ako nagpalalim ng kaalaman sa fact checking. Pero ang basic understanding ko is itong mga false information and disinformation, mas na-amplify siya in my view as a social media user nitong 2016 onwards. And I think parang merong nabuo na infrastructure of disinformation. And I think right now, yung nakikita natin sa social media, parang may ROI na sila, may return of investment na sila, which is scary. Pero ang mahalaga siguro sa ginagawa natin sa Facts First PH is multi-sectoral siya na hindi lang isang organization yung kumikilos. Kasi 'di ba kahit pa Rappler isa sa mga nangunguna sa fact checking sa Pilipinas together with other organizations. Hindi natin kakayanin na tayo lang Dapat sabay-sabay yung mga efforts na to. So, ayun, tuloy-tuloy lang tayo kahit na maraming mga threats, maraming mga iba't ibang intimidation na ginagawa. We should just still, sabi natin, courage on ba rin.
Yes. And parang it's just really important to start the movement and keep the movement going, keep the momentum, and hopefully inspire more people and more organizations to para mabalance yung information ecosystem natin right now. Dahil ngayon talagang parang yung those people who are on the side of disinformation, anong bigat nung ano nila eh. Na yung ano kumbaga yung weighing scale naka-tip over sa kanila eh. So we need more help, we need more people, we need from every sector, from the platforms, from journalists and down to the user, to the individual that uses social media. Not right, Jules?
Yeah, that's true. And yun nga yung interesting sa sa study na pine-present ng AIM today nila Gilbert. So parang from my view, kung Twitter user lang ako, parang in passing lang to sa akin eh. Parang 'di ba magke-trend siya for one day pero that's it. Parang lilipas din siya. Pero it's very interesting for me to see na nasisilip tong yung iba't ibang trends throughout time since October ata 2021 yun yung
ang haba from October nga to March eh.
Yeah. So simula ito nung nag-file I guess na yung mga candidates natin for 2022. So it's very interesting na ito yung trends so far on social media. But ayun, so sana maunawaan ito ng mga viewers natin kung paano ba. Kasi I think if you're comparing Twitter to Facebook, I don't know where the bigger problem is right now, but ikaw, Jello, what do you think ba?
Right now, based on sa study ni Gilbert ngayon, Twitter is looking more like an echo chamber for the side of Lenny Robredo, just based on the number of accounts and based on the sentiments being put out by these accounts. So that's certainly something to I don't know, maybe parse through more and maybe study more. And sometimes when you go through the tweets, diba, parang they're always saying na we have even the users on Twitter, they are kind of aware that this might be an echo chamber, and they have to go out of this echo chamber into other platforms, maybe to spread support for whichever candidate they are supporting. Ayun. Wait, we have Gilbert back. So, there. Welcome back, Gilbert.
All right. Thank you so much. So apologies for that. I think it really goes to show how the next election is very important. So yeah, I ran out of there was no electricity. Anyway, sorry. Going back to this one. Yeah, I believe this is. Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, so I believe this is where I left off. So we found that there is actually a very different behavioral pattern in terms of the accounts that tweet largely about Marcos Jr. and those that tweet about Lenny Robredo, wherein we were able to see some evidence of echo chamber-like behavior for those that are net Lenny, and as compared to those that are net Marcos Jr. However, it's good to revisit again the assumption that we made a while ago that just tweeting about a candidate implies a positive alignment to them. So we applied something called a community detection algorithm in order to find the tight groups or the groups of people who tend to interact with one another mostly. And then we looked at specifically, we looked at the cluster, or we looked at the community that had primarily tweeted about net Marcos Jr., wherein the proportion of net Marcos Jr. accounts was greater. And then we lumped them all up. That's why they're all red now. We lumped them all up regardless of their history, of having been tweeting about other candidates. So we looked at it through the lens of grouping them all up as part of a net Marcos Jr. Group. And what's interesting is that the accounts that were originally tagged as net Lenny, those who tweet a lot about Lenny Robredo, within the community of those that tweet about Marcos Jr. a lot, or the net Marcos Jr. accounts, they have negative tones about Lenny Robredo. So it's kind of like twofold. Within the community, there are two methods of tweeting when it comes to election-related topics. One is that they talk a lot about their own candidate, or the one that they've already been tweeting about before. In this case, it would be net Marcos Jr. It would be, overall. But on the flip side, there are accounts that focus on Lenny Robredo, those who tweet about Lenny Robredo in a negative tone. So there's a duality in the behavior of these of those who are supporting So now I qualify that term supporting for supporting Marcos Jr. And so the mislabeled accounts also tweet about Marcos Jr. If you were to go through each one of them, around 2,000 of them, they also tweet about Marcos Jr., but their topics and hashtags used did not rank among the hourly top 10 trends since October 2021 based on Twitter's algorithms. So they might have been talking all this time about Marcos Jr., but what was highlighted was their discussions around Lenny Robredo or their tweets about Lenny Robredo. So again, just tweeting about a candidate does not imply that they are supporting that candidate. It needs to be recontextualized into who they interact with, so that you can really see the structure of political polarization. And as a summary, net Lenny accounts have larger numbers of both tweets and accounts that express negativity in terms of absolute numbers. However, for the net Marcos Jr. Accounts, they exhibit greater concentration of negativity. For example, if this is what I was saying, that if you were to randomly pick a tweet or pick an account from them, it would there's a greater probability that it is talking about negativity. And for the net Lenny accounts, they show echo chamber-like behavior as they quote each other primarily. And they rarely seem to quote others of a different color or of a different group. And accurate measures of accounts supporting Lenny Robredo cannot be done just by looking at the net Lenny number alone. So I want to make that clarification that that as part of number 5, classifying the net Lenny accounts needs to be contextualized by accounting for the interactions with net Marcos Jr. accounts. So because and this is because of the nature of net Marcos of accounts that support Marcos Jr. They not just talk about themselves or their own candidate, but they also talk about other candidates. And whether or not the tone and the polarity, it's a bit iffy. It will need further study to fully determine how negative they are of other candidates. But that is an interesting behavior because we see, again, a duality in the behavior of net Marcos Jr. accounts, whereas opposed to those that are supporting Lenny Robredo, they are largely talking amongst themselves and quoting one another. And what now? What can we do with this information? So you've been talking for the past almost 30 minutes. And I just want to reiterate that at least based on the US study, the spread of fake news thrives on negativity and hatred for one another. And both of these are present on Twitter between and within the large groups of supporters for political candidates. So one suggestion that I have, one recommendation is to calm down and reflect if you contribute to an environment conducive to disinformation. So you may not be the one specifically believing or sharing fake news, but you could be contributing to the environment and the political polarization, which makes it conducive to disinformation. In I suppose an analogy for this would be like a powder keg, of gunpowder, wherein you might not be the one lighting the match, but you could be adding fuel to the fire for the eventual explosion, for lack of a better term, in terms of disinformation. So with that, thank you for sticking through me even through the technical challenges. And what I've just presented is the Philippine cyber political divide, political polarization on Twitter amid the 2022 Philippine presidential elections as part of our work under Facts First PH. Thank you. So,
all right. Thank you, Gilbert. Okay, so it's time for our Q&A portion. I will start, but if you guys have your questions, please send them in via the Q&A box. So Gilbert, what was the impetus for your study? What made you decide to focus on this particular subject, Twitter polarization?
So first of all, data on Twitter is largely easily accessible, and as compared to looking at it on Facebook, Facebook has much more stringent requirements or much more stringent policies when it comes to getting data. Wherein on Twitter, it's a bit more free, and that's one of the reasons why we decided to look at Twitter, because the accessibility of information. And second one is that we came across the article that was talking about, in the US at least, how political polarization spreads, and that was of interest to us because with Facts First PH, what we want to do is what we want to look at facts, and we don't want to muddy the environment with propaganda, with fake news, with misinformation and lies. And so we took that study and essentially used it as a blueprint in order to see how we can go about developing the research around it here in the Philippines. So just want to clarify that this research is not it's not by any means fully comprehensive. It doesn't cover everything, but it looks at a very specific part on polarization, and it can be extended further as we get more information, as we develop our understanding of the cyber political space here in the Philippines.
Okay. Are you seeing the same patterns that you in the Philippines that you saw in the US study, or are there surprising elements that you're only seeing here in the Philippine situation?
So so there are limits to this study. So the limitation was that we have been unable to track the movement of fake news itself, whereas the US study did that. So our research stops just short of that because we lack the information as of now. But what we look at is the environment or the polarization that gives rise to this one. So when we get the information, we can recontextualize that. When we get the information about the spread of fake news itself. For example, we are able to tag what tweet is actually fake news. Then we can relate it back to this study to see if there are difference between the Philippines and in the US.
Okay.
So,
Based on the studies done in the US and maybe from the insights that you've gleaned from the Philippine studies, how effective, this is a question from our one of our attendees, by the way. How effective would you say negative campaigning is?
so I cannot speak for the efficacy or the effectivity of negative campaigning. So what we've been able to show is that it does happen in various amounts and and it happens differently across different groups. So the jury, I suppose, is still out on the efficacy because we have yet to have the elections,
Yeah.
especially here in the Philippines. Yeah.
Okay, so this feels like a starting point for a bigger study, right?
Mhm.
So how do you think you'd develop this study further? Maybe going into the election and then after the election, just to keep studying, this very deep topic of polarization. Where would you take it? How would you develop it?
So what would be great is if we could have volunteers to manually tag and to do their fact checking on Twitter information, because a lot of the fact checking activity that has been going on has been focused on Facebook, because Facebook is the largest social media platform here in the Philippines. It's the one with the greatest number of users. Twitter is just it's less than that of Facebook. So there's been a lot of attention on fact checking things on Facebook, but it would be great if we could extend that type of activity, the level of fact checking capability, to Twitter as well. Because once we have that capability, we can now really see on a granular basis and track down see the trails that this information follows. And that's what would be of interest. Where do these fake news or propaganda or lies or misinformation, where do they come from? Who do they come from? What are their profiles? And what are the Filipino specific, or what is the Filipino flavor to it?
So basically more fact checking done on Twitter,
Yes.
along with Facebook, which traditionally
Yes.
have been our biggest target for fact checking.
Definitely. And
Okay.
yeah, on top of that, you can also connect the two. Facebook and Twitter, do they behave differently? Are there algorithms? Which of the platforms are more conducive to the spread of fake news and disinformation? And yeah, that would be an interesting study.
Okay. So we have another question from one of our attendees. From your experience with this research, what do you think is the reason why Filipinos find fact checking, at least a portion of Filipinos, they find fact checking as something negative.
Yeah. So this is going to be a bit more speculative than anything that rather than what the data shows is that I think Filipinos would be as compared to people in the United States. There is a different culture. There's a different culture in that I suppose we do not like to step on toes. We don't. We try to avoid being very direct. And if somebody tells you directly that you're wrong or that you're lying, we take offense in that. And I'm not immune to this. I don't think anyone is immune to that. And I think that is one reason why we find it negatively, because it opposes what we believe. It opposes what we want to happen when we get fact checked.
So it's kind of like a culture thing.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. We have another question, our third question from our attendees. It's about the spikes on the negative tweets and on certain dates. So seeing the spikes on negative tweets on certain dates and starting in January, did the presidential forums, debates, and interviews by media contribute to these spikes? Are there other spikes in tweets that happen in days without media-related election activities? Were there spikes that you observed that away from those media-related election activities?
Yes, so we actually found like a few spikes. It's sprinkled throughout, and it's actually sprinkled throughout since October 1 all the way to March 12, 2022, and they are not all related to media-related election activities. And they seem to come out naturally. They seem to come out, and we are unable to find the factor that drives it. But in terms of the contribution of media and the contribution of forums, debates, and to these negative spikes, that's something that needs to be looked at, because it's important to look at it from a data analysis perspective on what we mean by causality, on how we can attribute causality from one event to the change in another. And that will require a little more sophisticated tools in doing so.
Okay.
So yeah.
One of the findings of the studies that the accounts that were supportive of Marcos were tweeting more negatively, and that a larger proportion of accounts also had at least one negative tweet. Do you have any insights as to why this was happening? We've had previous studies where we saw that there were these batch of newly created Twitter accounts that were supportive of Marcos and then negative towards other candidates. Do you think that was a factor? And I guess in relation to that, was it taken into consideration these newly created accounts, fake accounts, or troll accounts in the study?
So unfortunately, one limitation that I had in getting the data for all of these, like a very large number of accounts, was that I was unable to get the age of the account. So with the method that I was using, I wasn't able to get the age of the account. And however, it could certainly tie into that because they belong to the same group. They're the people who the new accounts that were identified by Rappler before. They were the ones that were supporting Marcos Jr. And if we put them all into the same basket, then we can say with some level of confidence that they have the same behavior, that they tweet negative, that they do tweet more negatively than the other camps. So I think going back to the first thing that you mentioned, why do I think that certain accounts or those that have been supporting Marcos Jr. tend to tweet more negatively? That I can offer no actual insight into that. All I know is that it's there. It's open for further analysis because I would be speculating if I were to give an answer.
Okay. So we have two last questions from our attendees. How largely is political polarization contributing to the marketing of a candidate, or this polarization? What is the effect on the campaigns of these political candidates? I suppose it's it's creating walls, or is it something to that effect?
Yeah, as we saw with the behavior of the Net Lenny accounts or those that have been supporting Lenny Robredo, it really is more like an echo chamber. So it's like they built a wall around those around themselves, and there's very little activity going in and going out of that wall. And I think that makes it a bit of a challenge to reach out from within the group and from outside the group to the group. And that makes it challenging to get your message across to them. And it makes it also challenging for them to get their message outside of their own groups. And I think that's really the contribution. So if candidates or groups are wanting to sway one another to vote for the other, I think that really is a hurdle that needs to be addressed. How do you break down these walls so that you can have less echo chamber like behavior? And yeah, that's it.
Do you have advice for supporters of any particular candidate if they want? Of course, the assumption is you want to spread your message, right? So you have to break out of your echo chamber. Do you have any advice on breaking out of these echo chambers?
Yeah,
I guess first being aware of that you're in an echo chamber is already one step, right?
Yes, definitely. So first one is awareness. So I hope with this study, people will be more cognizant, or they'll be more aware of their own biases, of their own level of support for one another. And going back to the last thing I mentioned on the what now, is that it's better to calm down, because hatred and negativity are the things that really are factors that contribute to the spread of disinformation. And if you are expressing a lot of hatred and negativity towards one another, then you will be reinforcing this polarization, and it will be more difficult for you to get your message across. So be kind to one another.
Okay. Yes, that's certainly something that everyone needs to do. We have one of our attendees. They just want to clarify what your criteria was for considering a tweet negative.
Oh yeah. So it required a lot of human intelligence, I suppose, because it required humans to actually look at the hashtag, and from those hashtags, it can be quite apparent on what they mean. So it's either things like if you click that hashtag or that topic, then you look through the past activity around it, you can clearly see that it's speaking negatively about one candidate or another. For example, Lenny Duwag, Bring Back the Bunny, Marcos Jr., things like that. So they are things that if you were to look at a sample of the tweets, and again, this required human, there's some level of human opinion here. Everyone is more than welcome to challenge those opinions, and everyone is more than welcome to have their own interpretation. But if we're looking specifically at the hashtag, if it contains the name of a person and a negative attribute, then that is one surefire way to say that a tweet contains negativity.
All right. So that is all the time we have for questions in today's research briefing. Gilbert, do you have any final insights, final messages to our attendees today before we close the show?
Yeah. So vote wisely. I think that's the only thing I can say.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining the second Facts First PH briefing. And we hope to see all of you next week. And Gilbert, have a good day. Everyone, have a good day. Have a good weekend. And bye.
Thank you.
All right.